truck, so we had nowhere we could move. The truck drove up and pinned us against the wall. And this police officer came out and was very aggressive, and he was convinced that I was a drug dealer, that I was doing all these things that I shouldn't have been doing. I won't give you all the details, but there are things that he found on me, or things he found in my car, which was parked up there, that encouraged his story. You know what I mean? But there was nothing that was against the law. It was just, there were things about me, there was evidence of the trouble I was in that really encouraged him in his quest to uncover my Pablo Escobar, industries. So anyway, at one point he thought I was a flight risk and he handcuffed me. And I remember that was really jarring for me to have this man bigger than me, cursing at me, yelling at me, shaking me, handcuffing me, dragging me by the arms away from my friends. Then he arrested me. And he arrested me for something that wasn't true. And so I was sitting in the back of this police car, and at this point it was like 1 a.m, and I started weeping because I felt so vulnerable, and I felt so violated. And I also felt really guilty. Like, I just started to believe, man, what did I do to deserve this? Like, I got myself into this problem. And thankfully, there were 3 other police officers who showed up, and they convinced him, like, you can't go through with this arrest. This is a minor, and this would also be like the biggest civil rights case our town has ever seen. Like, this has to end, And one of them, I still remember his name, and I still see him around when I go home sometimes, and I thank him for what he did that night. But they let me go. So the whole ordeal took a couple hours. I go home, and I walk into my house, and my dad is awake, which is very unusual. My dad, a couple Christmases ago, we bought him a book, and he was reading it like this, like leaned over on the ground, and he fell asleep mid-page turn. That's like how sleepy he is. So to have him be awake at 2 a.m. or whatever was really unusual. And I walked in the house, and he immediately said, "Are you okay?" I said, "No, I'm not okay." And he said, "I felt really disturbed. Like, I felt like there was something wrong, and I couldn't sleep, so I waited up for you." And I just started to weep, and I started telling him what happened to me, and I started telling him how violated I felt, and how vulnerable I felt, and just how awful this was. I was a kid. I mean, I was 17 years old. And I was expecting him to be really upset, because they had my name, they had my information, I was entered into this record. I was expecting him to be really upset with me for getting myself into this problem, for being involved in things I shouldn't have been involved with, for looking a way that was against the norms and all those kinds of things. But instead, he put his arms around me and he said, "You are my son, and the police or nobody can touch you. And even if you have drugs, call me. Don't talk to them. Don't let them interact with you. If they hassle you, you just stop. And I don't care if you have drugs or guns or whatever it is they think you have. Call me, and like, I will come take care of you." He just poured out this love for me at any cost that was so against the way he had been raised. And it really, has stuck with me my whole life. I probably think about that almost daily. That was a moment where my dad's unconditional love changed something in me. It changed the way I understood the nature of my father's love for me. So, this story we're going to read today is that on a much greater level, a much more significant level. And you'll see why I couldn't help but think about that while we looked into this. So let's dig into Luke chapter 15, starting with verse 11. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. So we're actually picking up in the middle of 2 other stories that have just been told, 2 parables about a lost coin and a lost sheep. So Jesus is telling these stories about lost things. A man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, "I want my share of your estate now before you die." So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings, moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money on wild living. About that time, his money ran out. A great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him. and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. So I just want to pause for a second and highlight how horrible and unusual this son's request was. It is really just told really matter-of-factly. A son asked his father for his inheritance, but it's actually very unusual and really disrespectful. And I asked my dad, which, he didn't grow up, obviously, 2,000 years ago, but he in a place where there are a lot of the similar norms. They still have like a birthright for the firstborn son and those kinds of things. What would this have meant if someone asked, in your community, if somebody asked, in a village in Egypt, if someone asked their father for their inheritance early, and he was like, the thing I typically hear, before I get to that, answer that question, is the son asking his father is like saying to his father, I wish you were dead. It's like saying to his father, you don't matter to me, I wish you were dead so I could just take the stuff that I'm owed by you. What my dad said was if this happened where he grew up, it would really be the other way around. It would be the father, the family, the community saying, this son is dead. He's saying, this guy has rejected us so deeply, he's now dead to us all. And that's really how this request would have been seen. And the obvious sin here, like the thing we obviously see of this son, is his hedonism. He takes all this money and he wastes it on wild living. We hear later that he wasted it all on prostitutes. He's obviously very selfish. He's living this hedonistic life. But there's a deeper indication we see from his sin. There's something deeper going on that we get a sense of. Is that he didn't understand the nature of his father's love. He didn't understand the nature of unconditional love. And he was searching for the fulfillment that would come, the knowingness of being beloved. Is knowingness a word? The knowledge of being beloved would fulfill him, but he didn't have that. So he was longing. He was searching for something. And Henry Nouwen has an amazing book, which this sermon is totally plagiarized from. And it's about the prodigal son. And he says in there, he's talking about how he generally relates to the elder son, which we're going to talk about in a second. But it's when he recognized this deeper indication of what the son's frivolous living and his sin meant, that's where he associates with the prodigal son. He writes, I am the prodigal son every time I search for unconditional love where it cannot be found. I'll say that again. I'm the prodigal son every time I search for unconditional love where it cannot be found. So this son, yeah, he made a lot of mistakes. He lived wildly. He got involved in things he shouldn't have. But he rejected his father's love. He rejected his father. He rejected his tradition. Let's keep going in the story. Verse 17, when he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home even the hired servants have enough food to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I've sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, Father, so he begins his little speech, I've sinned against both heaven and you. I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. But before he can get to the third part of his speech, the please take me on as a hired servant, his father interrupts and says to the servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his fingers, sandals for his feet. Kill the calf we've been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he's found. So the party began. And actually, let's keep reading to then. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working. When he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants what was going on. Your brother is back, he was told, and your father has killed the fattened calf. We're celebrating because of his safe return. The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, all these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. And in that time you never even gave me one young goat for a feast with my friends. And yet this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes. You celebrate by killing the fattened calf." His father said to him, "Look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found." So the son, the prodigal son, had this plan. His point of repentance, when it says he came to his senses, that's not really him repenting. That's him coming up with another plan. And the plan was, okay, I'm going to die here, so at least if I can get myself set up as a servant, I'm going to survive. But his plan changed because his father surprised him. His father didn't react the way he thought he was going to react. His father embraced him. His father wanted to reconcile with him. So I want to ask everyone a question here, though, because the story could, in my mind, the story could end there. Like, you've got this bad son. He goes and squanders everything. He offends his father. He rejects his community. He rejects his culture. He's the biggest idiot in biblical history. Not really. There's a lot of bad people. But, for the sake of today, he was the worst guy. And his father surprises him with his radical love, embraces him, welcomes him back, affirms he is his son, brings him back to life. To a community that was ready to say, this guy is dead to us. His father brings him back to life. That's a beautiful story. There's a lot to unpack there. So why do you think Jesus includes the other son? The elder son.
Well, the context of the story, he's talking to church people. He's talking to people that probably more relate to the older son.
So if you couldn't hear Nathan, he said that the context of the story, Jesus is talking to the religious people of the day who don't really relate to this younger son. And in fact, they were just judging Jesus for hanging out with people like the younger son. So it's to connect with them.
Maybe like you said, the lack of knowledge of unconditional love can manifest in more than one way, not just because of something else like that.
The lack of knowledge of being beloved or of unconditional love manifests in multiple ways. That's good. Any other thoughts about why the elder son?
If he was the elder son, he would have the birthright. So he was the title to that. Yet the father was pretty generous and the younger son to give him what he did.
Yeah.
Generosity.
So Harry mentioned to display the generosity of the father, the extreme, accommodating nature of the father here by giving the younger son something. That was by right, the older son. Yeah, what I read was that the older son would be given 2/3 of the property and the wealth, and the younger son would be given the last third, but that it would be for the sake of serving the estate. And taking care of. So the generosity by sharing with the younger son. So the obvious sin of this son is his judgment. So like the younger son, he has some obvious things going wrong with him. There's some obvious brokenness in his life. He is angry. He is judgmental. He is resenting. But when we unpack that, what is the deeper indication of that? And what we see is that the elder son is very much like the younger son, in that he doesn't understand the nature of being beloved, of unconditional love. And what we see here is that he believes his father loves him because he's earned it. So he has worked super hard for it. He has obeyed his father, he's done everything he could, and he believes that he has earned his father's love. So we have one son who is searching for unconditional love in places it can't be found. And now we have another son who is trying to earn something that can't be earned. And I think Jesus really wraps up two of the biggest reasons we are separated from God Because obviously this story is about God's relationship to us as his children. Jesus really hits two of the biggest barriers to us being reconciled to God here. Some of us don't recognize how beloved we are by God. We don't recognize and really believe that and search for it in other places. We search for that fulfillment in a lot of things. And I am definitely very guilty of that. But I also resonate a lot with this elder son because I also can't believe that God loves me as I am. And that's just a confession. I just can't believe that. I can't even, even before I take communion, I have this marathon session of forgiveness where I'm just like, I'm so unclean. I can't believe that God accepts me and that Jesus gave his life for me, that I feel so unworthy, and I have to really list off every sin so that I'm finally worthy of God's love. So maybe you resonate. Actually, I'll ask, who do you resonate with in this story? And maybe that's changed over time, because I know for me, I definitely used to resonate with the younger son, and now I really resonate with the elder son. Who do you identify with?
I'm the oldest of three boys, so obviously I identify with the older son, having two younger brothers.
Yeah.
Who often, I know growing up that my clothes were in a lot better places on my brother's back than they ever did on mine. Because as my parents learned to parent, they became a little better with each kid down the line. And I can understand to some extent the older brother's resentment, because he was the one that toed the line. He was the one that Dad learned to parent on. And yet he missed, as I probably missed until I got a little bit older, the wonderful things that my dad accomplished by learning to parent me. And so I've always thought of that older son as the guy who should have had his eyes open just a little bit wider, because he missed a fabulous opportunity to do that.
That's good right there, from a actual eldest son. Could everyone hear that? Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I didn't even think about the parenting lessons here, but it's true that you learn to parent on your eldest children. So, whoever you identify with, everything I read and every sermon I looked at, everything really tried to find out, which son are you? Are you the son who is searching for love? Do you have a longing in you? Are you searching for love in the places it can't be found? Are you searching for that fulfillment? And perhaps that is you today, so think about that. Or are you the elder son who is constantly trying to be better, to earn something that can't be earned, which is God's love for you? Molly, are you going to share?
Actually, I think I flip back and forth.
Yeah.
I try to be the eldest, I try to do it right, and then when I feel like I'm not doing it, then I slip into the younger son, and then I look for it somewhere else. And then I'm like, yeah, to go back to the older son, okay, maybe this will work, and then I flip back. So I feel like it's back and forth.
It's like a pendulum.
Yeah.
When earning love isn't working out, then you comfort yourself by searching for it back and forth. Yeah, I do the same thing. I think what I want to challenge you to think about today is, certainly, if you are separated from God, if this is illuminating something in your life of how you view God and how you misunderstand God's love for you, today is a time to repair that. It's a time to think about that. To recognize that God's love for you has no ifs attached to it. If you do this, if you accept me, if you do this, it's already, God's love is already. It exists. You can't run from it. You can't deny it. And so I really want to encourage that. But I also want to challenge us to look at, and this is what I think Jesus does so well with these parables and what Jesus models for us, is how can we take on God's nature? And so as you become reconciled to God, as you recognize that maybe you've been searching for God's love and the fulfillment and knowledge of being beloved by God somewhere else, and as you reconcile to God, or as you stop trying to earn God's love and recognize it's there, and you're reconciled to God, it doesn't stop there. That's not where it ends. That's the beauty, I think, of so many of the things Jesus teaches us, is that when God brings us to himself, when God reconciles us to himself, that's beautiful in itself, but it doesn't stop there. It's for a bigger purpose. And it's to take on God's nature, to be influenced by who God is, and bring that to this broken world. And I think the challenge is to take on the Father here. I think definitely to reconcile with God is what we can learn from this. But then how do we bring that nature of God once we're reconciled and once we are one with the Father? And we look at Jesus, everything Jesus did was because God was telling him to do it. Jesus retreated into prayer, heard the Spirit, and then would go heal. Or Jesus would listen to the Spirit and then go to this city. Everything Jesus did rubbed off on him because of his relationship with the Father. And so that's what our challenge is today, is how do we bring that relationship that we have with God, once it's reconciled, how do we bring hints of God to this broken world around us? And I was thinking about the times where I've seen this and what a testimony it is to the world. There have been times when people have brought, and this is hard for me, I'll tell you that, because it's easy for me to want to love like the oppressed. It's really hard for me to want to love the oppressor. There's a lot of people in this world. I'm a very judgmental person. I judge all of you, right? No, I'm a really judgmental person. I'll just confess that. And I'm especially hard on people who I think are taking advantage of others. People who are oppressing the poor, people who abuse children, people who do things that I just think are, unthinkable. And I have this strong sense of justice. Like I've devoted my life to fighting for God's justice in this world. And my instinct is to want to punish and see those people brought to a criminal type of justice. But really what the challenge that Jesus is giving here is that those people you deem unworthy and undeserving are absolutely deserving of my love. Those people are beloved to me. Just as the impoverished child who your heart cries out for, or who you're upset that this corporation is oppressing, or whatever it is, those people are just as beloved to me. And to me, that's a huge challenge I get from this passage. And so I was looking at this is so inhuman. Like this is so not human nature to radically love people the way this father in this story is loving his son. So not in our nature. So where have I seen that? And the thing that came to mind was the story from 2006. You might remember a man went into a school, an Amish schoolhouse, and he held captive, hostage 10 girls, 10 school-aged girls, elementary school-aged girls. He ended up killing 5 of them before he killed himself. And this was a tragedy. I mean, this is so tragic and so heartbreaking. So many things about this story. But if you look at the news coverage, and I did like a Google News search about it, and found Time Magazine and Newsweek and USA Today, and every mainstream news outlet was talking about this. And instead of it being your typical news cycle around a mass shooting like this, where it's weird pictures of the perpetrator and it's trying to dig into who is this guy and why did he do this and what was his vendetta against the Amish and all these things, the news was totally dominated by reconciliation. It was this amazing testimony of who God is. Because that Amish community, the very day that those girls were murdered by this guy, there were elders in the Amish community who were teaching the young folk and saying, we cannot hate this man. We need to pray for this man and we need to pray for this man's family. They even went to his widow that day and prayed with her. 30 people from the Amish community went to this guy, the guy who killed their children, went to his parents' house, his wife's house, and they prayed with them. They extended forgiveness to them. They said, we know you're hurting as well. Then they attended his funeral, the funeral they had for the man who murdered their children. And they attended that funeral. And this is counter everything. This is not human. That response is not human. And it dominated the news. It really shocked the world. The way that this community would have been shocked by the way the father ran out to his son and welcomed him, embraced him. He didn't even just let him come and be a servant. He interrupted that plan and was like, "You are alive. You're my son. We're going to have a feast." He reconciled with him. I can imagine if he's on the edge of this town that the whole community, which was ready to abandon this child, this son who comes back, they were probably shocked. They were probably amazed. They thought the father was running out there to smack this boy, and instead he embraces him. I think that in the same way we saw this with this Amish community. And I really encourage you actually to read about it. There's a book written by Amish people about that story. It's really amazing about forgiveness. So I think that's our challenge today, is to take on this nature and be a testimony to this world of this radical love, which ultimately leads to reconciliation. So that's our challenge. So we're going to, the band's going to come back up. We're going to take communion. And I think it's especially appropriate before we take communion today to really examine and really think about and dwell on how God, the lengths God has gone to reconcile us to himself. And as we remember how Jesus poured out his blood for us on the cross, as we remember how Jesus' body was broken for us, that we might be reconciled to God. Dwell on that, meditate on that as we take communion.
Encourage you to find yourself in this first song that we're singing. It goes along with the sermon and just about how we all, in some senses or another, are prodigal sons and needed Jesus to come running to us and embrace us. So sing with us. Wandering, scared, nowhere to rest, harboring guilt. Life's breath had left, then you found me. Then you found me. Wandering, scared, searching for home. This road is so long. Surprised that you run to embrace me. For I am filthy. Oh, wandering, scared, nowhere to rest, harboring guilt. My last breath had left, then you found me. Then you found me. Wandering, scared, searching for home. This road is so long. Surprised that you run to embrace me. For I am filthy. So never let go, never let go. I tried it alone. I need you beside me. So never let go. Never let go, I tried on my own. I need you
I'm too proud to ask, too grown to eat, too weak to bow, too strong to lead. I'm too proud to ask, too grown to eat, too weak to bow, too strong to lead. Can you sing over me with words of comfort? Can you satisfy me, sweet honey? Can you break through me with your strong hands? Can you undo me and unheal me? I'm too proud
I think this is where we kind of talk about what is God saying to you and what do you hear God speaking to you today. And I'll start because I have a microphone. I think it's really hard for me to celebrate or to take joy. And what I was really struck with during this time of worship was that when we were reconciled to God, when we recognized we were lost and we were found, that's like the most beautiful condition to be in. And that is so worthy of celebration and joy. So that's what I'm being struck with today. Is this, the point in that story where the father says, let's party. It's easy for me to really be bogged down in the darkness of the world. But to remember that God's power, God's love is so much bigger than the darkness in my own life, in the darkness in this world, and really treasure that and party in that. But what do you hear God saying to you?
I think that sometimes in the way that I or we feel like we seek reconciliation or want to see reconciliation, part of the ingredient is wanting to see the rebellious person humble. Like, yes, I want us to forgive them or I want reconciliation, but I want to see that they really get it and that they're brought low. And then the forgiveness happens. And I think in this story it's so moving that the father is willing to be brought low in a sense by running through the field to meet him. There's something so upside down about that the father is not well, we'll wait till we'll make him walk all the way up the road, and when he gets here we'll see what he has to say, and then we'll decide how we're going to handle him. He just the glimpse of him down the road, and the father's willing to be sweaty and crying and whatever. And I feel like it really made me think about people that have been in my life where you see them walking toward their own destruction, walking toward their own death, in a sense, through addiction or whatever. And maybe sometimes there is that moment where you think, I have to let them go because they're choosing what they're choosing. And then you think, what would I do if I saw them walking up the road again? Oh, you would just run. The chance for them to be reconciled, the chance for them to have life again would just be so overwhelming. So I think that's just a really beautiful part of the story.
Yeah.
I'm always so amazed through the story over and over, but God always shows you something different every time you hear it. I like you struggle with the judgment. When I hear the story initially, it's always well, it's so unjust for the one that worked so hard and yet gets the same thing. We live near that victim line community that you brought up, and a friend had asked us to go to hear one of the parents speak, and I thought I was going to hear one of the mothers be Amish children that were killed, but we were going to hear the killer's mother speak. So when we went, at first I was like, oh, but again, it's the whole judgment thing, and when you hear her speak and tell the story, and she still reads to one of the children that was shot or is still handicapped every day, and we talked about how the Amish community surrounded her. They got in between the press and her at the funeral so that the press would not get to her. They were it's just, the story you brought was perfect.
Could you hear that all the way up here? She talked about the opportunity to go and hear the mother of the guy who murdered those Amish girls, to go hear that woman speak, and how she really testified to how the Amish community reconciled with her. They separated her from the press so that they wouldn't bombard her and destroy her in this time of her grief, and how she's even built a relationship with one of the girls that her own son had shot but lived, and she reads to her and spends time with her. So just that testimony, I think that that stuff is so, I don't know how I can hear those stories and not believe in God. You know what I mean? To see people respond to tragedy in that way, I think when that happens, that is like the Holy Spirit and God's presence bursting into the world And it's an absolute testimony to this world about who God is. Anybody else want to share what they're thinking about or what God's speaking to you?
For me, as we extend forgiveness, if the person that has been forgiven is not able to or hasn't made the choices to continue making, come down the road of healing and accepting God's forgiveness and living in this life of continued behavior, I think to me, and I think as a parent, I think that is the most difficult because as we're extending forgiveness, we're trying to continually lay down, for example, for our son, to lay him down and forgive him and God, when does that reconciliation come? I think to me that's the most difficult.
Yeah, and we don't even know in this story how it plays out. Like, obviously, there's this major rift between the eldest son and the father says, "You are my son, I've always loved you, everything I have is yours," but we don't know how he responds. And we also don't know if the prodigal son accepts this love. I imagine he had to do this more than once. You know, if this was a real story, not just a parable. I think it probably happened a few times.
I mean, the point of the story is transformation. You know, that both sons hopefully are different because of the unconditional love that they're experiencing from their dad. I mean,
Yeah.
the younger son probably didn't wake up the next day and go, you know, I think I want more money and I'm going to leave again. Maybe he did a month later, or, you know, again, but they're different, and we should be different when we realize how much God loves us and how, you know, again, you said there's no ifs in God's love. Because of that, that's why we're different.
I think so having a full grasp of that unconditional love makes us more able to be the father character. And I am struck by that because I'm so spectacularly bad at being that character. Like, it's so easy to get caught up in this. Like what Sarah was saying, this